This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. From time to time, we say something about people who pass on. And sadly, we lost Saeed Rush Didi to cancer. And he was only 40. I knew him from World Harvest Foods on University Avenue, where he worked with his father-in-law. He married into the Al-Hidi family. I think he had legal background, but couldn't practice in the U.S. because he didn't have U.S. credentials. He and Roa, his wife, have 2 children, probably about 4 and younger. And I don't think he ever anticipated that he would lose out to cancer. He was a healthy and handsome gentleman and was managing his father's store, which transferred from University Avenue to a banner on that triangle where it used to be IGA. And so they took over strawberry fields and World Harvest Food and expanded quite considerably. And so I go there fairly regularly, and Roa is my attorney. And so I thought I'd report on that. It's both families have an Iraqi background. The father came on a scholarship to study plant pathology or plant physiology and got a PhD here. And he had a brother who also was had a med degree. And he lost his brother, and I'm not sure how, but it's not easy to have one foot in one country and one foot in another. And he feels very much at home here. He's had his family here. Roa is his elder daughter, and she does quite well. And she's been beside Saeed for at least a month right now, and at Barnes Hospital in St. Louis, which is a very good hospital. And he was having a problem with blood cell counts and things like that. So eventually he lost out, unfortunately. And so we remember him. And if you're at World Harvest Food, you might say something in condolence. Today, I wanted to follow through from some of the other things we've been talking about. We were talking about last week about grottos, which sort of came from Europe, perhaps initiated in Rome, expressed in Lourdes, which attracts a lot of people, and with fairly heavy rules of the religious game. And so some of those people came from Europe and were priests, and not only studied in Europe, but also studied in the Midwest. And Jim Zanzi and Susan Lisa Stone wrote a book on secret places and other spaces, and it's a very good book, and it deals with that particular grotto and how it could be very academic grotto in the sense that it was a concept, an artistic concept, to a more informal concept with relationship to local memorial and coming back from World War One, and then another priest who did a grotto that was more oriented to nature and rocks and trees, and also informal. The church has changed over the years. It used to be very dark and formal, and gradually it's got more open and free-floating. So that's a background of some of the things you might work with if you're studying the landscape in East Central Illinois. Most of the grottos I'm talking about were in the driftless area in Wisconsin and northern Illinois, northwestern Illinois. And they got to include a lot of fun things, agricultural equipment that was out of date, or just ideas of fence lines and things like that. And enough inspiration that people would want to move to these sites and then take home the idea and create a garage that had all sorts of local idioms, or it might be someone who decided to do a program where he would dress up as Washington and he would introduce you to some of the things that he would do, and many of them were moving things. So the grotto has spread extensively, especially in Wisconsin. We had a small element of grotto in a pocket prairie across the road. It wasn't necessarily a religious thing, but people got to enjoy it. It was informally placed on vacant ground and run for 30 years. And people would enjoy to sit there, to read, to use some of the shade. We had prairie forests, so we had shade species and edge timber species and prairie. And even today, as we had last night a music festival, there were people there who made comment about the pocket prairie. So there are things that you can do. They might relate to your background if you're Scandinavian and in background, and Paxton, you might do something different than if you were at Ivesdale and Irish. You might have a German setting or an English setting, and your background would halfway dictate what you might be able to do and think about. And some people would step right out of that background, and other people would believe in it. Well, so most of the things that we've been active about have been natural areas. And it has some of the element of a cathedral. If you see an echinacea plant thriving on what used to be a gravel pit, then there's something that moves within you that initiates your interest in preserving that plant, and then into preserving it in relationship to other plants and creatures that might use it, like bees and butterflies and squirrels and what have you. We don't have the space for a buffalo anymore, but some natural areas do. And Nachusa has a herd of buffalo, and they can walk on the prairie and create the atmosphere that was there 10,000 years ago when buffalo were here or evolving here. So I want to talk about Shady Rest. Shady Rest is a 30-acre retreat behind White Heath. And as we think about what we do with these places, it's a good example of how we might survive these territories. Many of the grottos have been saved by a cola foundation, which restores and places these grottos in the care of local authorities, and they watch over this. In this case, Shady Rest has gone to the Piatt County Forest Preserve, which puts it into in perpetuity. That's what you like to see if you worked on a site for many years, and you want to see that it will go on to other generations. Well, this plot of land is on either side of a railroad bed that runs from Champaign to Clinton, and there is a Y at White Heath where you can go to Monticello, and that Y has retained its rails, so the Monticello Railroad Museum can actually go up to White Heath, and it actually stores vehicles on that 7-mile railroad bed. 3 miles of it is used for historic trains to go into Monticello and back out. But if you dream for perhaps something to happen in 200 years' time, you need to think about what you do now to create the skeleton for what you might be able to do. And it mightn't be what you had dreamed up. Not that we dream up anything, because we know that other generations will have their mind to do what they want to do, and that will read sense usually. This line down to Shady Rest is about a mile, and it could be a sort of innovative place where people could go for a picnic. It was 15 miles from Champaign, about the same from Decatur. It was a sort of place that you could take a horse to, and it wouldn't be stressed. And you would meet on the banks of the Sangamon, and there were a row of little cottages that you could rent, and you could go fishing in the Sangamon River or boating. Boating was not easy because as you have more use of the territory and more runoff, more of the trees fall into the river and create a blockage. So if you're on a canoe, it's going to take you a long time to get from Shady Rest behind White Heath to Monticello or to Allerton Park. It may take you the best part of a day, and you may have to portage around trees that have fallen into the river. There is an argument about whether we should clear out the trees that are in the river so that you have a good access and don't have to be worried about portaging your canoe. The biologists, on the other hand, want to see the fallen trees stay there and produce their rotting material and have it used by different creatures. So they are more natural in style. And so you have a conflict between recreation and biology. If you go to White Heath, we advise you to go out by Kirby because, especially if you're on a bike, you encounter traffic that is a relatively narrow highway and vehicles move at a very rapid pace. So Kirby is a country road when it gets out towards White Heath, and you have more room to breathe and watch the landscape. But this 30 acres is part bottomland, which is covered by water in flood time, but it is part Cerro Gordo moraine upland, and different species sought out. So as the trail has gone to the Piatt County Forest Preserve, it has been designated as a soil and water conservation easement, which gives it dignity. But there's also a railroad that went right through the middle of this place, and it was, I think, thought that this could be a small community. So it was platted for perhaps best part of 30 different homes and roads and things like that, but it never happened. Lick Skillet up the road, however, did happen. It didn't happen awfully much, but across the nation, as the railroads went in, communities were active to create a small community next to the railroad so that they could have commerce and industry and transportation. Originally, some of the people came up the rivers, especially when they were swollen and could be navigated. Later, people came up by train. Well, there's a railroad right away that goes down to Shady Rest. There are some houses that are more dignified than cabins. There are more homes that were lived in. They got to be decrepit and have been taken out. But the Price family, who owned the territory, probably bought it when it went defunct as a recreational retreat when cars came in and they could go further. So I'm thinking that the Price family probably brought it as a retreat. They had the oldest DuPont paint shop in the country, and they had a retreat for in a larger house, put together like Topsy, added additions here and there, but it was perfectly obvious that the Pope family and its clients had a fine time up on the hill, up on the Cerro Gordo moraine. You could drive in there, and I would sometimes sleep in that house, along with a few creatures like mice that came in and were part of the keeping themselves warm. Uh, there was a garage and were gardens, and it was a sort of place where people would like to commune with nature. There were trees that hung over, which wasn't always friendly because sometimes the limb would break and injure the house. But there are cats that are buried there. And I think there's one parrot that is buried there. It's the sort of place where you feel at home. And it's near the railroad line. It's near a house that's privately owned, but it looks just like a visitor center for a park district. It's the sort of house that you might like to buy as an informational center. That sometimes can happen. Can happen with the people who own houses like that, who would like to see them continue. There's a little bit of agriculture around, and that also could be allowed to go back to regrowth succession and enlarge the park. But it has now a parking lot, and once you go into the a forest preserve, it's usually controlled by the county board. Probably the people who are appointed by the county board, and they have a tax base, and the tax base allows for the putting in a small trail, and so you can go there and enjoy it. Some of it will be overrun with water when there's a flood stage. When the flood goes down, you have a chance to wander around on different eco settings. So the bottomland will have wet feet. The corridor into the park is long and straight, but on either side there are jack-in-the-pulpits or various spring herbs, squirrel corn and Dutchman's breeches and spring beauties, and the place is alive with spring herbs, and still continues to have plant life when the canopy comes over, and you have to have plants that can tolerate low light intensity. So they adapted to that sort of role. It has a bridge, and the bridge is a truss bridge that's kind of historic. The trains used to go down and across those bridges fairly rapidly because, especially if they're a freight train, they often couldn't get up the other side unless they had enough momentum to get there. So there are stories of people trying to wish their train over the hill at White Heath or other places like that. On the other hand, the trains would stop at the bridge and put on water. So there was a hydraulic ram which allows water to go into a dome, and then the dome pushes that water up to a water tower, and the water tower has a large 6-inch pipe that feeds into a train. So if you wanted water, you had to stop at the low spot. presumably you're going to get up the hill by yourself without a helper engine. But if it didn't happen, you would have to take the train apart in the middle and take up one piece and then come back for the other piece. And that would take you a day. Well, Mrs. Price, before she died, Mr. Price died previously. And so Mrs. Price still ran the paint store, but she still had this retreat. And I was managing it for quite a while and thinking it would be a wonderful retreat, and introduced people to it who didn't know it was really there, but were willing to help preserve it with the Piatt County uh, Forest Preserve. Uh, Now, what do we do? We have a railroad line down there, no rails on it, but it's largely on an embankment. So it's not the sort of place that you can put a parallel trail on. You have to think about having people to walk down the center of the rail, which is not something that engine drivers like to do, but it's something that could happen for many years until some agreement can be made. You can have schedules. You can have places where people can stand to the side. The historic trains from the Railroad Museum, which has Y access to this 1 mile. It So this sort of thing needs some regional planning because you don't exactly know what you might want to do. But either the Monticello Railroad Museum or the Champaign, Havana, and Western Historic Railroad, which is re-railing 4 miles of our railroad bed on the east side of the White Heath. So who gets to go down and who gets to have enough money to do it? We probably don't relate to the Rail Banking Act because we're not working with contiguity of rail beds. So if you have a Kickapoo Trail and it joins Havana and Danville, then you're likely to get rail banking support because if it goes back to rail, it is a connector. Well, we don't have some of that opportunity at Shady Rest. We can go down to the bridge. You can enjoy the bridge. It has local character, and some of the characters live nearby, and if they saw untoward things happening on the bridge, they would get on a tractor and go check out, and probably take a revolver on the side because these places get to be known by people who sometimes abuse the structure and the areas around. I want to say that this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial, and we're working with WEFT, and it's you should know that it's very pleasing to work with WEFT and spread this sort of information and to get feedback. Last night I was getting feedback from people who actually listen to my program. You never know. But there are people out there that do listen to this sort of typewriter. The other thing that could happen is this line goes up to Lodge. It goes past the truss bridge, past the trestle, over Madden Creek, a tributary that comes into the Sangamon at that point, up to Lodge. And at Lodge, there is a Norfolk Southern line that comes down. There's been quite a bit of debate about whether the Norfolk Southern line will close out. So if you know your onions and keep your nose to the ground, you will have the opportunity to perhaps have a historic train go three miles to the Lodge from Whiteheath. Might not even be 3 miles, but might be 2. And then if the rail bed were to close out, then the train could go south to Monticello. Then there's already connections to the Norfolk Southern there. You could bring a train back in to Nelson's Crossing. So you would have 23 miles of travel through interesting crossings of a river, of moraines, and stories about Indians and how they were moving west on a trail of tears and had some encounters locally. So there is a Bucks Pond that you could stop off and visit. It's possible if you do a historic thing like that, it is possible to stop and think and do. Historic trains are not transportation trains. You can't go from A to B and get off at B. You have to go to A to B and back to A. That's a different sort of accounting. But one needs to know that that opportunity is there. And there is also the opportunity that the Champaign, Havana, and Western Historic Railroad is trying to get historic trains from the Railroad Museum into Champaign. And if that happens, you can also join a Norfolk Southern line and actually go up through Mahomet and Mansfield and onto the same line. So there's networking there, and interesting things can happen if you do that on a Midwest basis or an East Central Illinois basis. The cost is fairly considerable, but it's a one-time cost. And as you use it for perhaps 200 years, it begins to cost per person not very much. One of the problems is that someone at some stage has to consider re-railing, which is costly to do, and there's no other commerce there that would share the cost. But there's a unique experience in the Midwest, and more we want to preserve those sorts of situations. And we need people who have enough knowledge of the area to think of doing that. I've been going to Grand Prairie Friends meetings, and silently in the background, suggesting that the Grand Prairie Friends might take on some consideration of regional planning. Might not want to do that, but they have the get up and go and pizzazz and capacity to at least consider that, whether it be a line coming in from Bloomington or a possible closeout between Allerton Park and Decatur, or how do you connect to the Kickapoo Trail to Danville? These are all elements that need some connectivity, and in order to do that, we need leadership. We need people who will volunteer to do chores that they enjoy doing, they enjoy the camaraderie, and but out of those 100 volunteers, if that's sort of what you have, you get 2 or 3 people who might want to investigate things a little further. And if they do and still are interested, then we have the challenge of asking them or begging them to think beautiful thoughts about overall planning, whether it be in Paris, Illinois, or Arcola, or Coles County, or Paxton. I like to dream about that possibility. And while the railroad beds are still here and being closed out, they are also the only retainers of remnant prairie. It's very, very difficult to do remnant prairie preservation. It's relatively easy to recreate a prairie, but it's not as biodiverse as a remnant prairie. So can we dream about asking the Grand Prairie Friends to have an overall look at the region, but also to have an overall look at the recreational potential of some of these connections? Since the only prairie we have left is in dead cemeteries that haven't been looked after, and on railroad beds, live or dead, then it might be germane to do a little more than prairie or forest preservation, but also get into the recreational act. You see it raising its very popular head, whether it be canoeing down the Sangamon with trees getting in the way, fallen trees, snags, or whether it be a wide trail from St. Joe to Oakwood. We're looking for someone who can combine that regional aspect of trails and rails in some case, and greenways in another case. Pretty difficult to do, but we need that. The alternative is to create a new organization that might be a networking organization. Fran Hardy, who has been a regional Department of Natural Resources manager, is now works with the Nature Conservancy, and he has had a lot to do with putting together an Illinois Prairie State Conservation Coalition. And it's been working very well for about 10 years. That is taking care of state business and what can we do to encourage volunteerism and what can we do to qualify various places, give them some credentials. So they're working at the state level. I think we need some people at a regional level, and that's why I'm sort of attending Grand Prairie Friends meetings and wondering if they might be to do that, because I need to know if they might do it and sort of take over some of our prairie efforts, especially at Rantoul, Paxton, or do we need another organization? It is not easy to find an organization that coordinates everything. There's been quite a few attempts to bring together all the natural history people, the academic people in natural history, the Nature Preserves Commission, or in the Natural History Survey. There's been an attempt to get together on one issue. It might be leachate of mining materials into a clean river, or the placement of a coal mine, or a road, and as the road goes through a natural area. Or there's a need, but the need lasts for a while. If it's a sanitary fill where PVCs are going into a landfill that's got 80,000 people drinking water from it, then there's a cause that lasts for a little while, but then it goes quiescent. At the moment, the Grand Prairie Friends is doing very well, and I would think that they might be able to extend to working with the recreation people who need the trails on the ballast of an old railroad bed, but also could be preserving the native habitat. So the new organizations, if they're going to survive, need people who have a lot of get up and go. They need to be paid to do what they do, and they're scarce. We need those sort of people who will take an idea into action. We're not short of ideas. There are people who come up with ideas all the time. It's a matter of taking them to the next level. It is the challenge. So if you're listening out there, I'm thinking that you might want to visit Shady Rest and figure on whether you would like to ride a historic train once a year down to Shady Rest and have a Chautauqua. The Chautauqua was a get-together of people, politicians and others, who might want to speak, and they could be interesting and could be a little rough and tough, but they were communications, and they were places where people got education. They started in the Lake Chautauqua in New York, and then proliferated. So now Chautauqua also implies a sort of meeting, get together uh, to work on an issue or just generally meet and greet and enjoy. Uh, it's spelled Chautauqua, Chautauqua, and it has certain characteristics that might be peculiar to your area. If excuse me, if you're thinking to do something with uh, bridges and re-railing, then you need that sort of background. Then you need the population of people to know. So if we're in Monticello, we need to know what the Monticello Railroad Museum thinks about the possibility of going 1 mile down to Shady Rest. We need to communicate with people who come to visit Allerton Park and Monticello itself. Monticello has a trail that's rather popular on our railroad bed that was bought by Heartland Pathways for that purpose, goes over the Sangamon and has been extended by popular demand. And so there's small elements of this that I'm talking about that could be an extension of an overall scenario. It's called regional planning, but regional planning can also be very specific. This one is broad. It might be between Bloomington and Paris and Decatur and Danville, and in that general area where you could do with a more specific involvement. I think we're getting near to the end of the time. I have 4 minutes on 1 clock. I like to leave some space for WEF to do what they do very well and announce what they're doing. They were out there last night communicating with the general public and letting people know what a not-for-profit radio station does and how far it will radiate and who might be involved. I talked to one of the musicians and they've been trying to encourage these musicians to come in at 6 o'clock in the morning for a show with live people. And he was saying 6 o'clock is kind of early, but it's a possibility. So getting a phone call, that might be that we've said enough. Thanks for listening. This is Dave Monk, the Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign.